Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Carl Mack. Over the next 15 minutes, Dr. Mack will share why he developed the Black Heritage Day calendar, his passion for Black history, and why he's excited to bring his content to the Google Assistant.
Sophia, thank you so much for the invitation. Very grateful to be here. Just a little bit of background about me. I'm originally from Jackson, Mississippi, and I attended Mississippi State, graduated with a mechanical engineering degree, moved to Seattle, worked as an engineer there for 18 years, also got involved with the NAACP and became president of the Seattle-King County branch of the NAACP. And my first year as president, out of the 1,800 branches or so, we were kindly awarded Class 1A Thalheimer Award from the late Julian Bond as the best branch in the country. And in 2005, I caught the attention of the National Society of Black Engineers. Since then, I've been happily retired. And for the past year and a half, I've been working on the fourth version of the calendar that we're going to talk about today, Black Heritage Day 4. And so aside from retirement, just enjoying life with my two boys. So the uniqueness of this particular version, Black Heritage Day 4, unlike the other ones, is that every day the entry is on this day. I didn't even think it was possible to do it. In this version, that is what I was able to accomplish, is that, and I'll just give you an example. So on May 25th, in almost every version of the calendar, I had Jesse Owens on May 25th. I had Jesse Owens on that day because in 1935, that was considered one of the greatest days in sports. And so in the Big Ten championships, he set 4 world records in a span of 70 minutes. Well, as I was working on the calendar last year, the murder of George Floyd occurred. My mom calls me up like, Carl, I know you have George Floyd in the calendar. I'm like, Mom, I really don't, because May 25th is taken. Well, you need to put George Floyd in the calendar. So I had Meghan Markle on March 31st. Well, Meghan simply married royalty. So I moved Jesse Owens to March 31st, which freed up May 25th. I wrote George Floyd. When I started my career as a mechanical engineer in Seattle, I worked with this white guy named Henry Cody. And Cody was an engineer, but he was a historian before he decided to switch over to engineering. And so one day I came to work and Cody was talking to me about an article he read about this guy named Henry O. Flipper. And Henry O. Flipper was the first Black to graduate from the West Point Military Academy, which is the first engineering school in the country. So as Cody is talking to me about this, I have no idea who Henry O. Flipper is. And Cody is looking at me like, I absolutely know who Henry O. Flipper is. So when the conversation ended, I literally felt ashamed and embarrassed. If I had to give you 100 words about Black history, and that's Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, I would still be 94 words short. That's how little I knew about African American history. And so I had this calendar on my desk, and it was called Word of the Day. So one day I'm riding back from lunch, August 16th, 1990, and literally God put this idea in my head, like, Carl, what if you had a person for every day of the year out of Black history? And every day you could just get a 2-minute read, and you can learn about your history. From there, I spoke to a guy who gave me ideas about where to get information, because I didn't know even where to go get information. Books weren't available. And if they were, I mean, if you went to the library, there's this small little section, and the books usually were on slavery, usually on the typical people, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, or not necessarily Malcolm X, Martin, Rosa Parks, Frederick Douglass, Thurgood Marshall, this typical people that you always hear about. So not a whole lot of information. So the young man told me, he said, Carl, you should call the Schomburg. I said, Schomburg? What's a Schomburg? He starts laughing. He says, the Schomburg is a public library in New York City, and it's probably the greatest single literary source for housing Black history information. So true, I called the Schomburg up. They gave me some references to start with, and then one book led to another, and I just became obsessed with it. And then another guy by the name of Marvin Moore told me about the technology, because at the time, I didn't know. I knew how the format was supposed to look, that I wanted a picture of the person, I wanted their name, their titles, birth date, the year they were born, the year they died, and then I needed the text about what made them so relevant in Black history. But I didn't know the software to use, so he introduced me to PageMaker at the time. And now keep in mind, when you start talking about technology, the hard copy on the hard drive on the computer I was working was a baby Mac, and it was 40K. That was the drive space on this computer. I didn't know about scanning images. I didn't know anything, but I knew that I wanted to learn. And as I got inside the history, it just became obsessive. So for the next 2.5 years, day and night, any time away from work, it was all about researching Black history, and the world was just opening up to me in this phenomenal, incredible way that literally transformed my entire life. So when people ask me about my involvement in civil rights and how did you lead the NAACP in Seattle from near obscurity to be in the #1 branch in the association, it was because of what history did for me. It just made everything different. Everything became clear. So that's how I started Black Heritage Day. And the first calendar I did, it literally was a tear off. So every day you would go in, just like the page of the day. After you read the page, you tear it off. Well, this reporter saw my calendar and was so fascinated by it. And his name was Ron Fitton. And Ron said, Carl, this is incredible. I want to do a story on this. So oddly enough, and he was a reporter with the Seattle Times, which was the largest newspaper in the state of Washington. So he gives me a call up about a week later, and he goes, Carl, we're having some problems here. And I go, well, why are you having problems? He says, well, you have in your calendar that Daniel Hale Williams, a Black man, did the first successful open heart surgery. And my editors are saying, we need proof of that. And I couldn't do anything but just laugh. And so I sent Ron to several sources to verify. But again, you didn't have the internet the way you do now. So I provided him certain books so that he too can read that. But it just gave me insight to how little, not only did I know about the African American experience, but all of America knew about it. And so when we did the calendar and the story appeared in the Seattle Times, my phone just rang off the hook from the time I got to work till 8, 9 o'clock at night. And that's how I began to sell the calendars. And somebody from Mississippi State found out about the calendar, and they decided to work as my PR. So the long and short of it is, next thing I know, Gannett News Services, that owns 80 some odd newspapers in USA Today, saw the calendar. They ran a story, released it to a lot of their papers, and the first edition I sold out of. Hey Google, what happened on this day in Black history? And Google can tell me, on this day in Black history, Elizabeth Kelker, who was a dressmaker at the White House, was born or died, whatever the fact is. Just the mere fact that it's telling me something about somebody I did not know. And I can ask this question every day. That was the level of excitement that people had when they saw the calendar. But again, this version of the calendar, Black Heritage Day 4, when every entry is on this day. So in the previous versions of the calendar, I may have had 75% of the people on a day significant in their life, and the other 25% was just in the calendar. So now to know, December 6th, Google, what happened on this day in December 6th? On this day in 1865, America ratified the 13th Amendment, thereby ending slavery in this country. Google, what happened on January 1st? On this day in 1863, those enslaved considered this heartbreak day. January 1st was considered the most dreaded day of the year because families were separated. Google, what happened on this day on December 31st? On December 31st, 1862, Blacks gathered together, hoping that Lincoln would sign the Emancipation Proclamation, and from that became the services known today as Watch Night. And so even though I tell you that story about Watch Night, I cannot tell you how many Black folks I've asked, have you ever gone to church on New Year's Eve? And they all would tell me, yeah, we go, and it's called Watch Night. And I say, well, do you know the history of Watch Night? No, we were watching for the new year to come in. So when I tell them the history of Watch Night, which again, when President Lincoln talked about issuing the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, Our ancestors were in such disbelief, they were in such anticipation that they gathered in churches and worshiping places all over the country, and they stayed up all night, quote unquote, watching for freedom. And that's how the term Watch Night came about. So it's this type of information that people are just so incredibly excited about. And to think that I can get this level of information every day by saying, Google, what happened on this day in Black history, blows my mind. It absolutely blows my mind with excitement. When I studied history and I understood the price that was paid for me to have the opportunity to go to school, to learn that James Meredith from my state integrated Ole Miss and what he went through, I remember even when I was at Mississippi State, I remember sitting in thermodynamics. I couldn't even spell thermodynamics. And now I'm listening to my white classmates ask the professors questions about the first and second law of enthalpy. I'm like, how do you even know to ask the question? So I felt this feeling of inferiority. Now, had I known my history, had I known that Henry O. Flipper, born into slavery and at the age of 21, became the first Black to graduate from America's first engineering school, believe me, I would have had no feeling of inferiority. I would have understood why I don't know what I don't know. But I certainly would not have felt inferior in that situation. So I watched this history absolutely take my life and transform it. You know, you think about the trials and tribulations of almost every group of people, specifically in this country, Native Americans, women, African Americans, Asian Americans. So you can think about the atrocities, the challenges, all of them. And so let's say in the case of African Americans that people want to do something to be more inclusive in their diversity and inclusion initiatives. But the people making the decisions is homogeneous. There's no Black folks making those decisions. But yet you want to try to do something for me. How do you know that what you're going to or what you want to do is not insulting to me? And I'll give you a classic example of it. Right now, Juneteenth is about to be upon us. And throughout, I don't care where you go in this country, the knowledge that people have about Juneteenth is that on June 19, 1865, when General Gordon Granger rode into Galveston, Texas, and found those Blacks still enslaved, number one, they were the last Blacks to be enslaved. And number two, they didn't get the word for a year and a half after Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, he said, those 11 states in rebellion against the Union, slavery is no longer legal. Now keep in mind, those 11 states formed a new nation. They formed a confederacy. They elected a president, a vice president, a Congress. They wrote a constitution. So what Lincoln said to them in an executive order, it didn't matter if those enslaved in Galveston, Texas got the information that very day. It wasn't going to matter. To that new nation called the Confederacy, Lincoln had no authority there. So the fact that they got it a year and a half later doesn't make any, historically it doesn't make any sense. But then here's the real problem. When Lincoln issued that order, he said, now the 4 border states that did not leave the Union, Maryland, Missouri, Kentucky, and Delaware. Now there became a 5th border state, and that 5th border state was West Virginia. But when Virginia seceded from the Union, there was about 40 some odd counties in West Virginia that said, look, we are pro-slavery, but we are not about we are not about secession. So they applied for statehood and got statehood. And they came into the Union as a slave state. So there were 5 border states. But before the Civil War ended, West Virginia abolished slavery within the state. Maryland abolished slavery. Missouri abolished slavery. But Delaware and Kentucky, those 2, they never abolished slavery. So when the Civil War ended on April 9th, 1865, and 2 months later, Granger goes into Galveston, Texas, those of our ancestors in Galveston, number one, they were not the last Blacks enslaved. there were 225,000 other black folks still enslaved in Kentucky and Delaware, and they did not get freedom until the ratification of the 13th Amendment on December 6th. So the point that I'm making here is that now in this country, 47 states have now said, we're going to designate Juneteenth as a state holiday because it is our intent to bring about recognition of the end of America's original sin, chattel slavery. I so respect your intent, but you could not be more historically wrong and insulting. What's most important to me is the fact that we can get this out every single day, because in our community, you will hear black folks even disrespect the legacy of Dr. Carter G. Woodson. Dr. Woodson started Black History Month. Now, when it started, it was only a week. And it was in the mid-70s that Black History Week became Black History Month. And he started Black History Month in February because of two men. Abraham Lincoln, who was born on February 12th, and Frederick Douglass, who was born on February 14th. But Frederick was like many black folks. He didn't know the exact date of his birthday, but when he was a child, his mother called him My Little Valentine. So Frederick chose February 14th as his birthday. So from that, Black History became a month. So now today, I can't tell you how many times I've heard black people say, Black History should be 365 days of the year. Well, that's what I tried to do with Black Heritage Day 4. And now Google, welcome to this fight, because now with On This Day in Black History, the fact that my people, my children, and others can simply ask that question, hey Google, what happened on this day in Black History? Allow me to say this, but that warms my soul. I know you're going to edit that out. That's okay, but it warms my soul. So I am so grateful to all of you for it. I'm very pleased. But anyway, I'll leave it there.
Dr. Mack, thank you so much for sharing your phenomenal story and important message with us. At Google, we respect and observe Juneteenth. And in partnering with you on this day in Black history, you're helping us all discover that there's so much more context and deeper meaning to this and other important dates in history. I'm inspired by you and everything that you've done to ensure that we can easily access this information on our assistant devices. And I want to demo it for everyone so that they can see how easy it is to trigger this action. You can just say, hey Google, tell me what happened today in Black history.
Opera singer Matilda Ciceretta Joyner Jones passed away on this day in 1933. Jones was often referred to as the Black Patti, a reference to Italian prima donna Adelina Patti. While racism held her back professionally, she nonetheless performed for 4 U.S. presidents. During a tour of the West Indies, the president of Haiti was so enamored with her talent that he presented her with $500 in gold. Adapted from Black Heritage Day 4th calendar by author, lecturer, and civil rights activist Dr. Karl Mack.
It's so great. It's truly a phenomenal experience. Thank you so much, Dr. Mack.